Probably nobody. All right, so we're back in. All right, are we ready? Okay, cool, sweet. So one of the biggest aspects of Christmas in our culture is spending. People spend more on this month than any other time of the year. Americans plan to spend an average of $1,047.83 this year, and that's up from last year. I don't know if that number kind of feels like monopoly money to you, or maybe it doesn't feel like a big deal to you, but I think the bigger thing is that every year there's this group called Lending Tree that publishes a spending survey, and here are some of the stats from the survey that they took this year. 61% of Americans, 61% are dreading the holidays because of higher spending. 57% say they're dreading Christmas specifically, that it's Christmas that wears them out. I want you to think about what that means, that our culture begins to dread Christmas. The pressure of holiday spending causes people to lose sleep and causes them to go into debt. Millennials, any millennials here? You can admit it. Any millennials? All right, millennials, that's right. Millennials, listen to this, are particularly feeling the pressure. 71% of millennials say they feel obligated to buy gifts, and about 50% of them say they want to give the best gifts. That's the pressure that they feel in the groups around them. 69% of parents, who are parents? Any parents in here? 69% of parents are worried about disappointing their children this year. Right? Almost 70%, and 75% of parents are feeling pressured to buy more gifts for their kids. And these are the craziest numbers to me that say something's wrong. 40% of those parents that they surveyed say they expect to go into debt this holiday season. And 30% are still paying off debt from last year's holidays. That's how spending affects our culture. Now, there seem to be two answers in the world. We live in a world that's kind of bifurcated, that's binary, that's either or. And the two answers that you generally hear for the issue of spending in our culture are either you need to make more money, right? You need to make more money so you can afford what you want to spend things on, or you just need to spend less money. And those aren't bad ideas. Both of them are potential answers to what's going on. But one of the things that the Bible teaches is that there's always something deeper going on, right? That it's not about the surface thing. And another thing that the Bible teaches is that when the world thinks it's either this or that usually God is doing something else and saying, no, it's not this or that there's actually another way. There's actually an even better way, a way that is ultimately about the connections that are happening in your heart and in your soul and in your community, and the transformation and hope that can happen when people connect to God. God looks at things like spending in culture and the stress and the anxiety and the pressure and the debt and the overwhelmedness and the desire to want to give the best. God looks at those things and he says there's something deeper going on, and it's not about your bank account as much as it is about your relationships. And so that's why this week we want to look at that idea. Is that it's not about a number, though numbers may come into it for some of us. It's really about what's happening in our hearts. And it's not about making more or spending less, but it's about learning how to spend wisely. Right? The Bible values wisdom. There are books in the Bible that are just dedicated to wisdom. And what it says is the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That actually being in deep connection with God and being in reverent connection with God is where wisdom starts. So we're going to look at a story tonight, and we're probably going to keep looking at it actually next week, in Matthew chapter 2, about some people that are traditionally referred to as the wise men, right? You know them? That's not their last name. They weren't like Bob and Frank and Leo Wiseman. But the wise people, in the Bible, they're called the Magi, which is kind of a take on magicians, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We usually think there are 3 of them, but we don't know how many there were. There were probably more than 3. They probably had a giant entourage, actually, that they traveled with. But we're going to look at the way that they choose to spend what they have this week. And then next week, we're going to look at the way that they give during the first Christmas. So I'm in Matthew chapter 2. It's going to come up on the screen, right? Awesome. And it starts here. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So there's a lot that we could talk about historically here, and there's a lot of rabbit trails that we could go on, and some of them are interesting. We're not going to go on all of them, but just for historical accuracy, because we think that's important, we think here that Christmas was an actual event, not just a good story, that this is actually this is taking place, a lot of this, 2 years after Jesus' birth. So just wrap your mind around that. Don't be freaked out about your manger scenes. Just settle in. It's okay. It's okay. Mary and Joseph probably traveled back and forth from Bethlehem after Jesus was born, but for whatever reason, they chose to take up a residency there. It was Joseph's hometown in terms of that's where his ancestors were from, and so there are a lot of reasons they could have decided, but apparently they're living in Bethlehem. And because this King Herod is alive, and we can see historically who Herod was and when he reigned, then the belief is that Jesus was probably born, and this might really blow your mind, between 6 and 4, what we call BC or BCE, right? And you're like, wait, I thought BC meant before Jesus, but it's okay, right? As we started to date things, this is kind of where we're at. So that just gives you a little historical grounding so you don't get sort of lost in whether or not we really think that this actually happened. So Magi, these people, these wise men that we talk about, they were non-Jewish. So it's interesting that they were traveling to find the King of Israel. They were kind of part astrologers, part wisdom seekers and givers, and part historians. We don't really have anything that matches what they were. They were a little bit off. They would have probably made most of us uncomfortable, thinking that they're suited into this story of Jesus, which I think is a good thing to remember. Most of the people that were suited in the middle of Jesus coming to earth are not people that fit well into culture and into society. They probably came from Babylon, and they probably traveled around 900 miles to get to see Jesus. So you can imagine the amount of time and resources they spent to understand what was going on. Israel's prophets had talked of this period of world peace that was going to come, and that belief had spread out beyond Israel, so that these guys probably would have heard of it either from Jewish people who lived in their area, or the stories would have just carried over time. And so there was this belief that a king was going to come from Judea and was going to have worldwide importance. And these guys were probably coming not to worship Jesus as the Son of God or as God incarnate or any of those things, but they were probably like ambassadors. They were probably people coming on a journey, and they were like, there's a king, and we need to find this king because we want to have this king's goodwill. We want to be in good connection and good relationship to this king. And so they're giving rightful homage to Jesus as the promised ruler to arise in Israel, but they end up doing more than they ever would have thought they'd done when they started the journey. So Herod, an important thing to remember about Herod here, if you want to know, is Herod was not a nice guy. Herod had a lot of problems, and there were a lot of reasons for Herod to be paranoid. Herod killed a lot of people. Herod killed a lot of his own family members in order to stay in power. There was a saying about Herod that said it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. Right? And the words pig and son in their language kind of matched up, so it was a bit of a pun. But it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, because Herod would just kill his family members to stay in power. And so for sure, Herod was worried about people that were going to try to take his power from him. And so that's why you see Herod saying, I got to figure out where this king is. Herod does not want to pay homage to this king. Herod wants to kill this king. And that's understandable. But what's really difficult is that it seems like the religious people, the teachers of the law, the people that were supposed to be guarding the word of God and the desires of God, were also worried. Right? And their reaction, who they aligned themselves with, kind of gives you a sense of what the spiritual health was of Israel and their leaders at that time, that they've aligned themselves politically with Herod because if his power base was threatened, so was theirs. And it's important to pay attention to that because we can align ourselves with sort of powers of the world, and then we can become afraid when those things are threatened, and that might keep us from God's desires for us. So that's a lot of what's kind of going on here, and what happens in the end, and we'll get more into the second part of this next week, but what happens in the end with these guys is that these magi, not only do they spend a lot of time and energy and resources to get to Jesus, but then in order to honor Jesus and not honor the political structures of their time, they have to spend a lot of time and energy and resources going in a roundabout way to get away from Herod's military rule. And they're willing to do it because of who Jesus is. So what can we learn from these guys about how we spend? That's what we're going to focus on this week, and then we're going to learn from these guys next week about how we give. Well, the first thing that we can see with these guys in particular, excuse me, too many hands, is that they spent their resources on listening and learning for eternal purposes, not just on immediate gain. Right? These magi invested their time and their studies and their life into searching for wisdom and revelation. They looked at the sky, they looked at the historical wisdom, they looked all around, they looked beyond even their own culture to find out what was true and what was good and what was worth following. They didn't take the easy route in the way that they spent themselves, but they took the wise route. And sometimes the wise route actually ended up costing them more than the easy route would have. And spending wisely, even when you think about spending at Christmas, I know this is a little bit of a stretch, but I really want you to hear this because I think in our culture, spending is such a big part of Christmas. Spending wisely asks the same thing of us, that we would plan, that we would research, that we would cultivate relationships with God and with others, right? And that's a lot harder than just looking on somebody's Amazon wish list, than just trying to get the latest gadget or even a gift card, right? And you're talking to somebody that struggles with spending wisely. I'll talk about that. Like Jane's returned 90% of all the things that I've ever bought her. And I'll talk about like how I've had to wrestle with that and how I had to deal with that too. But I think it's important and it matters because at Highlands, we value relationships over stuff. We believe the best way to spend what we have is in good relationship to God and in good relationship to others. I want to show you guys. Will you throw that next slide up there really quick? So this is a big way that we try to look at, that I try to look at life and engaging well. So we have this belief that life sort of exists in all these different dimensions, and that when life is operating well, there's good communication between God and us in every dimension. That when our spending operates well, it's not even about a number or a rule. It's not about only spend this much because the world spends this much, or only buy for this many people because you have this much. It's about listening to God and saying, God, what does it look like for the way that I spend to reflect that I have a relationship with you? And that's what we want to encourage everyone to do, not to spend like I spend. I'll share with you guys a couple of things that I do. I don't want you to spend like me. I want you to listen to God and spend like God tells you to spend. Because I think that the most abundant life you're ever going to have is when you spend in line with what God would want for your life. Does that make sense? I want to drive that home, because that's what I think that the Magi ultimately did, is that they looked to revelation. They looked to wisdom. If you'll see, we also put there what your core belief is. Those guys didn't know the God of Israel, but they were seeking something deeper and something more, and God connected with them in that. And in that, they ended up spending well, and they ended up spending wisely. The second thing I think we can see from the Magi and how they spent is that they were aware of but not manipulated by the powers of the day. They were aware that there were powers that existed around them, but they didn't let those powers manipulate them and force them to do things that they ultimately knew were unwise. They weren't afraid to buck the trends of their culture, even though the religious people were. The religious people were afraid to go against Herod when it came to the king of the Jews. But the Magi weren't. They were willing to be different. They were willing to be authentic, and they were willing to risk offending. They didn't let the ruling powers determine how they would use what they were given. I don't want to go really deep into this. If I have a couple of minutes, I'll take questions, and you guys can come after me about this. But I think consumerism is a huge power in our culture. I think we're all consumers, and that's just what we do. And I decide that I eat things that I want, right? And I go to restaurants that I like to go to. That's part of being a consumer. We consume. But consumerism is more like this thing that Jesus talks about in the Bible when he's referring to money, and he says mammon, because mammon is this personification. I think what happens is that the idea that we need more things and better things and bigger things and newer things becomes a driving force and a god in our lives. And the Bible says a lot about money becoming a god. A lot. There are 2,000 references to money in the Bible. And Jesus talked more about money, most of you probably know this, than he talked about heaven or hell or most anything else. It's because Jesus says that our heart and what we spend on are closely connected. And if we act like they aren't, we run the risk of money becoming our God. Money isn't evil. That's a false understanding of the Bible. The Bible says the love of money, putting money first in your life and in your heart, is the root of a lot of evil. And that money can become a god, and you can't serve God and the God of money. And I want to tell you guys this. I really want to encourage you, Highlands, because this is actually something that I think we actually do really well. I don't think that this is something we struggle with so far. Right now, we're putting together our first budget. I know it's super exciting for most of you. It's kind of exciting for me. We're going to present it to you guys probably sometime in January. We're finalizing a budget. And I want you guys to know that as I've looked over the budget, less than 10% of our budget is spent on stuff. And 90% of our budget is spent on people and caring for people and giving. And we've made a commitment as a leadership team to continue to live that way. And so I actually think that we do this really well, but I want to tell you that I also think that it's important that we do this well, not just as a church, but as individuals, because when we live in a world where 40% of parents think that the only way that they can be good parents to their kids is to continue to go into debt year after year after year, we need to present something different. When we live in a world where people are losing sleep because they're afraid they're not going to have enough to give Christmas gifts, we need to live for and represent something different. So what can we do? 2 quick things, and I'm done. First, we can invest in our spending. We can invest in our spending. And what that means is not invest more money into our spending, but really it's invest more time into our spending. We can take time this Christmas. You can still do it. You're like, but I already bought all my things. Don't worry, everything's returnable. We can take time and study not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it with our money this Christmas. Why? What's driving your heart? One of the most important questions you'll ever take time to ask yourself, and I encourage you to do it daily, is why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Why am I feeling pressure around gifts? Why do I feel like I have to go into debt year after year after year to celebrate who Jesus is? It doesn't make sense. Second thing we can do to invest in our spending is we can just ask God. It's as simple as that. Just ask God, God, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do with my money? One of the things that I believe in my core is if you ask God and do your best to listen to what God is telling you, that whether you're right or wrong, God is going to bring you to the place that he wants you to be. God cares for us, right? The Bible says he knows that we're dust, and he recognizes that we're imperfect, and he's there to care for and connect with us. And then the third thing is we can prioritize relationships when we spend, right? That we can decide that when we spend, we can spend well on relationship. Here's the really tough one. How many of you guys go to a workplace where you have like a gift exchange or anything like that, or you draw names or do those things? Would you have one of those? Anybody have that anymore? No, is that out? All right, here's the thing. Here's how you know, all right? The person whose name you draw or that you exchange gifts with, give them lunch with you, or coffee with you, or time with you. So I told you guys, Jane returns 90% of what I give her. So here's what I started doing. I started giving her time, because Jane likes time. And so what I do, and I want you to know that this is the hardest thing I do every Christmas, is I say to Jane, I will go shopping with you for an entire day. And I will go into the stores, and I will walk around with you, and I will watch you walk around every store and think about 15 things that you're going to get and get none of them. And then I will go home empty-handed with you and watch you not spend the money that I gave you again and end up using it on our kids. And that's what I give her every Christmas, because that's what the relationship desires. That's it, is time. So prioritize relationship. Second thing is this. Second thing we can do is that we can decide to celebrate differently. One way to celebrate differently, and this is hard, this is super hard for me because I'm cheap as can be. I'm cheap as cheap can be, and you need to know this about me. But we can know what we're buying. Spending wisely doesn't mean spending nothing. It means we thoughtfully evaluate what we support with our spending, and we allow our spending to support products, people, and causes that are worthy of being supported. That's one of the ways we can really be different in terms of how we spend. I want the cheapest, fastest thing that I can find. And some of those things do terrible things to our environment. They involve giving people less than they deserve to be paid throughout the world. And they don't reflect the kinds of things that God wants me to be spending my money on. And one of the ways that we can really live differently than our culture is we can decide to know more about what we're buying, and we can let God speak into that. And the second thing is we can decide not to take the easiest route when it comes to celebrating Christmas this year. We can give hope to people by bucking the trends in a risky way. And that's not necessarily a number or how we spend, but it's being willing to wrestle with how we celebrate Christmas and not just doing the sort of things that we do because they're easy, and remembering it's Jesus' birthday, not ours. And so what we do should probably reflect that in some ways. There are ways that we've done that for our kids growing up. We used to bake a cake every 25th of December and then sing happy birthday to Jesus. And it felt weird and cheesy and whatever, but that was one of the ways that we bucked the trend, right? What we would do is, one thing we've done is we've told our kids, you get 3 gifts because Jesus got 3 gifts. And early on in their lives, we would say, you have to wrap up 3 things and we're going to take them somewhere. And we would take them over to Must Ministries, or we take them to somewhere where kids pick out gifts, because we wanted to live in a way that said Christmas is different. Christmas is different for us because for us we're celebrating Jesus' birthday. And so I would encourage you to look for ways to buck the trend and invite people in to that. Tell people about it, not in ways to promote you, but in ways to promote spending wisely over Christmas. And we're going to talk more about that next week when we talk about that you can actually give more when you spend wisely than when you just spend a lot. So here's your applications. Personally, here's an application this week. Personally, I want to challenge you to make a list of who and what when it comes to spending for you this Christmas. Even if you've already spent on them. Who and what. Some of you, that's it. That's your entire week. You're going to have so many people. And you need to figure out, what does that look like? Right? Who and what, and then pray over it. And just ask God, what does wisdom look like in this gift? Last year I did that with Jane, and it was like the best thing, I think you said was your favorite gift that I've ever given you, was that I bought a calendar, and I taped money to each month of the calendar for a date night. Now, the best laid plans of mice and men fail. We didn't make every month, but we did pretty good, right? And it was a way to spend wisely on my wife, and so I'd encourage you to do that. And then for your community, pick an alternative way to celebrate Christmas. Pick an alternative way to celebrate Christmas. I know Rodney. Is Rodney in here? What do? They buy like tilapia or something. Rodney, every year, Rodney Sloan asks people to buy fish for farming in developing countries so that people can have food. Some people buy wells or pumps. There's all kinds of things. If you just go online and say giving for Christmas, and you look up some of these things, there's all kinds of places where you could give in an alternative way to celebrate Christmas. You can do the bake a cake. You can have all those things. Every idea that I've used, I stole from somebody, steal them from me. Do something, but just pick an alternative way to celebrate. Because I think that as we actively choose to prioritize Jesus in the way that we spend, we're just going to be transformed. We're not going to have to try to act like transformed people at Christmas. We're going to be transformed people at Christmas.